And away we go. So the first lesson here is the origins of religion. We're done with the free speech, globalization, culture. All that was to give you a overview, some context of how we're going to study religion. That it's not going to be so much about why do they believe what they believe. It's more about why do they do what they do? Where do those beliefs come from? What does it look like in their everyday life? What does it look like in the world? How does it influence the world, and how does the world influence them? So we're going to get into this with looking at where religion came from in the first place. But at first I want to ask you, is this heads or tails? On the count of three, everybody say what this is. Ready? 1, 2, 3. Wrong. It's tails. See? I can see it right here. It's tails right there. You see? There's tails. You're telling me it's heads. No, it's tails. What's the point of that? Well, I see tails. You see heads. Which one of us is right? Well, we both are. But that's kind of weird. How can two contradictory things be true? Well, it all depends on which way you're looking at it. So for the reason I'm using the discussion, the reason I'm using that as an example is when we talk about religion, I'm right in what I believe. And lots of other people think they're right. So who's right? Well, that's the thing about religion is even in a religious faith, like Christianity, for instance, you're going to have more than 1 billion people who profess to be Christian, which means you're going to have more than 1 billion ways that people think Christianity works, the way it looks, the way it should factor into their lives and their decisions. So it's really important to keep that in mind when we talk about religion. It's not something that we are going to approach, especially in this study, and especially whenever it's been in my classroom. It's not where we're saying this one is more right about this or that one is more wrong about that. We don't talk about it like that. What we talk about is how does this work in people's lives? How is it affecting your life? Even if you have no religion, if you were not raised with one, or maybe you've left whatever religious faith you were raised in, how does it work in the world? That's really what we want to look at. So the first thing we got to do is, what is religion? Well, it's a belief about humankind, about the world, about the universe, about life, about death, involving some kind of supernatural component, like a god or gods, some kind of deity creating us or creating humanity or influencing humanity in some way, often carried out with specific practices to try to connect to that deity, to try to acknowledge or thank or whatever that deity. So religion as a whole is a set of beliefs that are then put into practice. So it's in history, it's been in history. Whenever we see archaeological digs, you're going to see statues and paintings in caves of stuff, which a lot of times are religious in nature. Every civilization, every major civilization, and we define civilization as a place, roughly, I've always called it CROGS, CRAWGS. Cities, religion, art, writing, government, and social structure are these 6 components. Religion is one of those things. So in major civilizations, like going back to the Egyptians, well, the pyramids exist because of their religious beliefs. We go back, look anywhere at any time in history, you're going to see some kind of religious belief. So it's nothing new. It's not something that was invented by the Illuminati to try to control people. It's not something that was made to be an opiate of the masses. It's something that has been a very meaningful, very intentional part of people's lives since human beings have existed. So what we see in the West especially is some borrowing, some adaptation, some introduction, some innovation. Sometimes things are taken and changed like the Romans did. They basically just took the Greek gods and goddesses and gave them new names and called it their own. Which, by the way, if you want to separate religion from society or religion from government or whatever, well, you need to rename every day of the week and rename almost every month, or let's see, most of the months, I should say. Actually, every month except up into September, because those are all religious in nature. Monday is for the moon. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, Tyr, the Norse god. Woden's Day, Wednesday, Odin, the Allfather of Norse Viking mythology. Thor's Day, Frigga's Day, Saturn's Day, the Day of the Sun. It's all religious right there. January, Janus, the god. Februa, the goddess. Mars, the god. I mean, like religion is everywhere in our society. We see it all over the place. And in And I've got some videos that I'm going to put in the links. There's some really cool explanations and stuff. I'm going to skip around here, but it's not something that we can avoid or escape. So we definitely need to understand it. And if it's something that adds meaning to your life, it's something you should pursue. If it doesn't add meaning to your life, obviously don't. Religion has been so important to society, though. Think about all of the energy, effort, resources that have gone into religious life. I mentioned the pyramids. Think of how complex and complicated not just the civilization had to be in order to build it, but the organization went into to building it, and how much time and energy and effort it took to build those pyramids for something, what, that just like somebody's going to do like on a random day just because they feel like, you know, they need it. No, like it was a very serious thing for the Egyptians. It's been this right here we see in the middle. This is called a ziggurat. These go back to the earliest civilizations. Whenever we see ancient city-states that were the first building blocks of civilization, the C in Krogs of civilization. Cities, actually, civilization itself comes from the Latin word civitas. Civitas is what it looks like, which means city. So in the center of these cities, we see these massive temples. Societies have put so much energy and effort into honoring their religion, their gods and goddesses. I'm going to put this link up. This is a pretty cool Origin of Religions video. So there's a difference here. There's polytheism, which is a belief in many gods. So poly means many. Theism is a belief in a deity, or like theism is like a belief in God. So polytheism is what we saw in most of human history up until the Jewish people came along, the Hebrews. So Egyptians, Greeks, Romans, that's all something you're familiar with. Tribal religions are often polytheistic. Polytheism is usually about gods and goddesses or natural spirits animating the world around us. That the trees and the clouds and everything around us has some kind of divine moving force individually. Now, monotheism is mono, one, belief in God. So the Abrahamic faiths is what they're called because if you ever had Sunday school, Father Abraham had many sons, had Father Abraham. Abraham was the first Hebrew and the first one that said there is only one God, that is God Yahweh, I am. So the religions that we talk about in class, that I'm going to talk about in this series, are Hinduism, Judaism, Buddhism. I'm not going to talk about Taoism because I never taught it in class. This and Sikhism are new additions. So I'm going to leave those out of this. And Christianity and Islam. I'm not leaving them out on a qualitative basis, just quantitative. I don't have a lot of experience teaching them. I know a lot about them, but I don't have enough in-class experience that I can say interesting things that I know stuff about. So Abrahamic faiths is what was mentioned a second ago. That is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It started with Abraham, who was the father of the Jewish people, and then also through Isaac, and then also Ishmael, who is the progenitor of the Islamic faith. And Christianity is something that came out of Judaism. The thing is, when we talk about religion, there is a concept of God. In different languages, there's a lot of languages that have a word for God. So, for instance, Allah is God in Arabic. Yahweh, God, for Christians or in the West. Brahman is the Hindu conception of God. And that's something that's going to be really interesting, I hope, for you to learn about, is that the Hindu conception of God. I'll put this video up there. It's really cool. It shows how religion spread throughout the world. Kind of like when we talk about cultural diffusion. Well, religion is part of that diffusion, that you might have a merchant who's operating along the Silk Road through the Middle East, from the Roman Empire through the Middle East over to the East. Maybe that merchant is also a Muslim or is a Christian, or maybe that's somebody from over here that's a Buddhist and they bring their faith. The faith makes its way along. It's really cool to see how it diffuses. We will talk a little bit as we go through these of different time periods. The diffusion of Christianity, for instance, was aided through contact with other people. Islam was aided through contact with other people. Sometimes it's conquest, where a conquering people bring their religious faith with them. Sometimes it's through economics. Sometimes it's through proselytizing, knocking on doors. We see Christianity and Buddhism spread most particularly by conversion, telling people about it and converting them. But then we also see a government instituting their way in another part of the world and bringing their faith with them. So we will talk some about how that looks in the Middle Ages. And then we also see in the modern period, really the spread, and as we look at this video, as you see this video, you'll see how it progresses along. The Middle Ages is where we really start to see people coming into more contact with each other, in part because of the Crusades. That was where the West and the Middle East really met. But really, it was where the West met the East, because the Middle East had already been in contact with the East through the Silk Road and through trade networks, and because they have a whole bunch of ocean trade networks here. And Europe was kind of cut off from the rest of it. The Crusades is really where Europe got introduced to the rest of the world, and that spurred a whole lot of stuff like the Renaissance. And then the spread of Islam from the Arabian Peninsula out through North Africa and then up into Europe, and then even over going towards into India, all of which we will talk about. So then there's a boost, I guess you could say, when Europe began colonizing the Americas, bringing their predominant religious faith with them. And we see some other things that cause an explosion of religious faith, like when the printing press is invented and the Bible is able to be printed so more people read it. The Protestant Reformation, which then, I guess, further personalized religion for people, so that there's not just one dominant political force and religious force in Europe. Now it's opening up to anybody all around. So we're going to go through some of these things as we start looking at it. But when it comes to the origin of religion, this video is really going to be useful. And in a nutshell, people have always looked up at the stars and wondered how many there were, and wondered what's beyond them, and wondered what happens when we die. Where did we come from? How does all this exist? People have always wondered that. It's not something new. If you've ever thought that, actually, if you've ever thought any thought, there's a pretty fair chance that of the 7 billion people alive in the world right now, and I think it's something like 100 billion people that have ever lived, there's a fair chance that other people have thought that thought. And so religion is people's attempt to try to answer some of those questions that we don't really have an answer to just yet. Do we go somewhere when we die? Well, I've never died, so I don't know, but I do believe that when we die, we have an option, heaven or hell. So these institutions that get created are made because people are trying to find answers. And whenever they start recognizing that other people have those same questions, well, let's put our heads together and what can we do? And people start noticing things. And so religion really came about from people recognizing a question. There's a driving question there. And then they start setting up rituals. And so maybe it makes sense that when you say certain incantations or do a certain dance or something and it rains, well, maybe you should do that whenever you need rain. Or maybe it hasn't rained at all and you are afraid it's because you've done something wrong and the gods or goddesses are punishing you. The Egyptian, it's really cool story about the Nile and the Egyptians. Like, they have some really cool, beautiful stories that are a lot of times meant to explain natural phenomenon. How come it's raining? Well, we don't know that. So if we don't know the answer, we need an answer. Human beings need answers. That's why we are driven to create and invent. We're trying to find solutions to things. And sometimes a question needs a solution. And so we start looking for it. And lots of faiths hold that sometimes those solutions are divinely revealed, that someone in particular receives enlightenment or receives the word of God or the deity and gets the answer. And then that person then goes and spreads the answer, tells the answer to as many people as possible. Sometimes that person gets the answer, enlightenment, and they're done. They're on their way out. That's something we'll talk about with Buddhism. So there's a whole lot of really cool stuff that we can talk about with this. But really, when it comes down to it, natural phenomenon is where we see a lot of early religious icons, like statues to fertility goddesses. Fertility was a big deal because people needed to make sure their crops would grow. And not just making a statue, but what can we do to make sure that the gods and goddesses are happy? And so that's where we start to see the original development. But I'm going to talk specifically about the religions themselves, beginning with Hinduism. Until next time.